Good morning, not afternoon yet, good morning and welcome to Spread Spectrum Wireless Security and the World's Most Beautiful Geek. And by the way, that's not me, the world's most beautiful geek. We're talking about someone else. The someone else we're talking about is this lady up here called Hedy Lamarr. Those of you who are younger probably have never heard of her. She certainly doesn't look like a geek, does she? In her movies, interviews, she never sounded particularly technical either. Yet Hedy Lamarr, who is cited in 3 decades, even 4 decades, as the most beautiful woman in the world, holds the patent, or she held, she's dead now, but she held the patent and was granted a patent on a frequency hopping technique that serves as one of the cornerstones of everything we do today. Every cell phone uses it, among other things. A very rare mix of brains and beauty. She never received a penny from her inventions. And I say inventions plural, she had a bunch of them. She signed over the rights to frequency hopping and to spread spectrum to the Navy. But the Navy at the time, 1942, didn't really know what it had. We're going to cover her story, her invention, and how it relates to security for the mobile connected world that we live in now in 2014. The agenda for this, and it's, what time is lunch, 4:30? We have until 4? No. I know, I'm between you and lunch, and I understand that. We'll look at young Hedy. We'll look at her first marriage, first of 6, by the way, how she got her technical learning, and how she escaped from that first marriage. We'll look at Hedy in Hollywood, at someone you probably never, anyone here ever heard of George Antheil? Last time we did, somebody else did. Somebody in Boston heard of him too, a musician. So I heard of Antheil. We'll talk about it. He was crucial in the invention also. We'll look at the inventions and the patent. We'll look at the Navy saying no to the invention, but thanks for the patent. A little bit on spread spectrum itself and how it's used today, and something just a bit on Hedy's latter days. Then we'll go lunch. Here she is, Hedwig Eva Maria Keisler. Born November 9th, 1914, in Vienna. Vienna as a city at the time was rare in Europe in that people tended to get along with each other, even if there were different religions, even if there were different ethnicities. Her father was a banker. Her mother was a concert pianist. Both of them were Jewish, and yes, anti-Semitism was alive and well then. The Dreyfus trial in France showed that several years before. But they were assimilated Jewish, and they got along very well with everybody else in Vienna. She was homeschooled. She learned languages. She learned ballet. She learned piano. She learned horseback riding. She learned all sorts of things. And she showed a very early interest in acting. Her mother called her an actress all the time. Hedy's quite an actress. When she was 15 years old, coming home from a place where she was going to a store or something, she passed by someone who was in this new industry called movies. And she just was interested in it. So she walked in, she was beautiful at the time, even at 15, and socially engineered her way into a job as a script girl. She basically asked the producer, hey, is there a job here? And the guy said, well, have you ever done scripts before? And she said, oh, yeah, I can do that. And they hired her. Well, he looked at her and hired her. A year or so into that, she started getting parts in the movies. She talked her way into movie parts, and she convinced her papa. She had her father wrapped around her finger, just probably as much as my granddaughter has me wrapped around her finger. Anything she wanted, anything Hedy wanted, Emil would give her. She came home when she got the job at the movie place and said, Daddy, I want to drop out of school. And Daddy said, well, okay, if you think it's right, okay. Now, at 18 years old, 3 years into her working at this studio, she starred in a movie. It was the 4th movie she was in. And in this movie called Ecstasy, she was featured in the first ever scene where a human being was completely stark naked. That's her. That's her in the movie. Her parents, she took her parents to the premiere. They were shocked. They walked out. They still loved Hedy, but they walked out. The movie was banned in the United States. We never allow naked things on screens in the United States. Well, whatever. But people in the movie business now heard the name Hedy Lamarr. She got some more roles in Germany and in Austria, and she got attention from somebody who was very rich, one of the richest men in the country, a guy named Fritz Mandl. He was an arms dealer, and he would shortly become husband number one. She rejected him, and then married him. It worked like that for her. He was extremely possessive. He didn't like the fact that people were looking at pictures of his wife naked, so he tried to buy up every existing copy of the movie Ecstasy. The fact that we have some prints back here says that he wasn't quite successful in doing that. And on the internet, you can still find some. No more movies for Hedy, no more stage for Hedy. But she did attend dinners with him, with Fritz. And Fritz was an arms dealer, selling arms to Austria, to Germany, to basically to anyone who wanted to buy them, but primarily Germany and Austria. What Hedy did at these dinners was keep quiet and absorb knowledge, sitting next to generals and majors and colonels and industrialists and people who were creating arms and coming up with ideas. And she looked glamorous. She said, any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid. But meanwhile, she was soaking up knowledge on weaponry. What she learned at home with Fritz and his military clients played a critical role later in the things that she was inventing. There was a German, again, somebody you probably never heard of, called Helmuth Walter. Anyone ever heard of him? If you've heard of Georgia and Thiel, maybe you've heard of. Anyway, this guy was Germany's submarine genius for propelling submarines, for torpedoes, etc., torpedo-designed submarines, etc. He talked about using hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, as fuel for submarines and as fuel for torpedoes because it would leave them weightless so you couldn't track them and see where they were going and try to avoid them. And at dinner, here he is talking to here's this guy who's basically a nerd, a genius but a nerd, talking to this stunning woman. And what is he going to talk about? Well, the things he knows about. Weightless torpedoes, H2O2, things of that nature, wire guidance. Hedy listened, smiled, batted her eyes, as she said, back again, look stupid, but she listened and she learned because she was anything but stupid. However, while this was going on and she was learning about torpedoes and learning about aircraft and learning about armaments and learning about whatever, she grew further and further away from Fritz because he was more and more controlling and more demanding. She wanted to go back on stage, not movies first of all, but stage. She wanted to be a stage actress again. And she really resented the fact that Fritz didn't like that idea. His possessiveness, his jealousy, he didn't want to share it with anybody. So one of the things he did to try to make her feel good was say, why don't you go away to St. Moritz for a few weeks? Go in winter, go to Switzerland, see what you can do. Well, at Switzerland, all was not quiet on the Western Front because she met the author, Erich Maria Remarque, who wrote that book and had an affair with him there. Fritz didn't seem to mind that so much. I don't know if he ever found out about it, but he didn't seem to mind. She also enlisted Fritz's best friend, who was a prince, Prince Starhemberg. And Prince Starhemberg helped her get a stage role. When Fritz found out about that, he was furious, not only at Hedy, but also at his former friend, the prince, for having helping Hedy disobey his orders. Well, Hedy at that time said, that's enough, I'm finished, I'm done. Went to Paris, divorced Fritz from Paris, went on to London. She was trying to get to America. What she was trying to do was get to Hollywood, get there. In London, she met Louis B. Mayer, MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. This is the mayor. If there is a caricature of the Hollywood mogul, the casting couch and all that, this guy fits that caricature. That's what they're all based on. That's him. She met him, and he had seen Ecstasy. And this is a quote from him. I don't like what people would think about a girl who flits bare-assed around the screen. That should be only for her husband to see, etc. Meanwhile, he was saying this and acting the prude, but he was looking at her from every angle he could think of. He offered her a job, $125 a week for 6 months, trial, a contract for that. She had the nerve at that time, even though she had no job, no support, she had left Fritz, to say no to him. She turned him down. Wasn't enough money. So what she did was buy a ticket on the Normandy, with the ship that Mayer was using to go back, and said, I'm going to go on this ship, I'm going to go there, and I'll show this guy and we'll talk some more. Every time Mayer would see her, she would be with a new man who was absolutely dazzled by her. She'd walk by on the promenade of the ship with one man, then walk by with another, and every one of them was basically just completely dazzled. At some time on the ship, he changed his offer and said, instead of $125 a week for 6 months, how about $500 a week for 7 years? And at that time, 1937, that was a heck of a lot of money. She accepted that offer then. Now, I don't know what else they did on the ship, but the thing that Mayer didn't like was the name, Hedy Keisler. 1937 U.S., we were having difficulties with Germany, so was the rest of Europe. Keisler sounded much too German. He didn't like that name, so he was looking for a different name. Mayer's wife was with him on the trip. Mayer's wife didn't like the fact that all these young girls were visiting the casting couch with her husband. One girl named Barbara Lamarr, L-A space capital M-A-R-R, had died earlier that year. This girl who died, she was 29, and she had also been considered the most beautiful girl in the world. She was a favorite of Mayer's, but certainly not of Mayer's wife. Mayer's wife decided that Hedy's last name ought to be Lamarr, L-A-M-A-R-R, no space, no capitals. Mr. Mayer said, okay. Hedy said, okay. So in 1937, Hedy Lamarr showed up in Hollywood. Now, meanwhile, she was 22 at the time, 22 going on 23. She really didn't go for the party girl routine, but she did play the game. She went to parties, she went on dates, she did this, she did that, whatever. But what she preferred doing was spending time at home inventing. And this, I know it sounds weird, a 1930s actress, she built in her home a library of technical manuals. And she built a workspace at home and used it every single night when she wasn't out partying. She preferred doing this. That's what she wanted to do. She also was a little chubby, according to Mayer, so she lost some weight. She learned English. She had known other languages, but she learned English, and she started getting parts, getting more. Now, the first part she got was not with MGM. It was with another studio. At that time, studios would loan actors and actresses to each other, and she was loaned to another studio to do a movie called Algiers. And if anyone has ever heard the phrase, come with me to the Kasbah, she was the one to whom that was uttered. She was the one, come with me, you come with me to the Kasbah. She became a full-fledged Hollywood star, started making a lot of movies, but she also started to show signs of divahood. Lots of movies, but she really wasn't very happy. And the main problem was the fact that she had a brain. And this was not expected or utilized or appreciated by the bigwigs in Hollywood. You're not supposed to have a brain. Just stand there, look stupid, and be glamorous. She grew petulant, she grew uncooperative, she demanded things. She really became a diva. And then she started marrying people. This was, I guess, another hobby of hers. Gene Markey was husband number 2. Remember that name, Markey. You're going to see that, or you're going to hear about that a little later. Married him 1939, divorced in 1940. She married H number 3 was John Loder. With him, she had 2 kids, one of whom is still alive, Anthony Loder. Then divorced him after 2 kids. Number 4, Ted Stauffer. Number 5, Howard Lee. Number 6, Louis Boyce Jr. After Louis Boyce Jr., she said, you know, I've had enough of this marriage stuff, and basically didn't do any more marriage. But she kept inventing. Through all of the Hollywood years, through television, through whatever, she kept inventing. Now, scene switches. Hedy's there, Hedy's working Hollywood, Hedy's a diva, Hedy's known, Hedy's marrying people. There's another guy we have to think of. And again, you probably never heard of him. George Antheil. He wrote an autobiography, Bad Boy of Music. And the reason he called himself that is because some of his earlier works caused riots in Europe. Now, I know a lot of things cause riots in Europe. The first time Singe's play, Bad Boy of the Western World, ever was run in Dublin, there were riots all over the Abbey Theatre. The first time this Ballet Mécanique, his work, was played at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, there were riots. Now, meanwhile, Ballet Mécanique, mechanical, some people, of course, thought it was a sign of genius that there were riots. He used airplane propellers, chainsaws, player pianos, hammers, electric bells, all sorts of things which you don't associate with musical instruments. But nonetheless, some said, oh, it's genius, it's one, and now it's accepted as one of the canonical works of modern music. He's more appreciated now than he was when he was alive. He was a composer. He was a musician. He wrote magazine articles. He wrote books. He was an inventor. He was an expert in criminal justice. He was an expert in military history. He had a deep interest in endocrinology. The guy was truly a polymath. About 5'6" tall, little guy, looked very unassuming, but very, very brilliant. Now, remember that endocrinology. He wound up in Hollywood. He was in Europe doing most of his stuff. He was an American, went to Paris, did things, came back, and he wound up trying to make money, so he wrote film scores for Hollywood movies. It was, to him it was kind of beneath him, but he had to do it to make money, and he made money doing it. Now, Hedy had just dumped husband number 2. She was anxious. She was concerned. Remember, Mayer made her lose some weight, so she lost some weight. And now after she lost weight, Mayer said, well, Hollywood, we want you to have bigger breasts. He implied that her breasts were too small. So she was even more nervous. She heard about George's knowledge of endocrinology and glandular knowledge and asked a friend to set up a meeting with him in August of 1940. What did they tell George? Hedy Lamarr wants to see you about her glands. When they met, this is from George's autobiography. He says his eyeballs sizzled. I don't know what that means, but it sounds painful for one thing. His eyeballs sizzled. She was undoubtedly the most beautiful woman on earth. Undoubtedly. He had and his wife was a good-looking woman too, but anyway, this is what he said about her. And as far as that post-pituitary, that's George's quote too. Take from it whatever you want, whatever. Subsequently, after talking about glandular things, and he said she was fine, there's no problem, don't worry about it. They started talking about other things. They had both been in Europe and seen the rise of Nazism, and they both hated it. They were both very patriotic towards the United States. Hedy was very much a U.S. patriot, even though she was an Austrian girl. They started talking about the war, and two of the things that really bothered them were 2 incidents where children got killed. And that was the torpedoing of 2 ships, the SS Volendam and the SS City of Benares. In the Volendam, about 6 kids got killed. In the City of Benares, it was more like 123 kids got killed. They talked about that, how evil that was. They talked about her munitions knowledge. They talked about torpedoes. They talked about wire guidance as opposed to radio frequency guidance. They talked about multiple ways to do things, problems that we're having with torpedoes, problems with other munitions. His book, The Shape of War to Come, laid out almost precisely what Hitler would do. Clearly, obviously. Guy was good. He was very, very good. They talked about the need for alloyed torpedo guidance. One of the problems that haunted the Allies at the end of World War I into World War II was the fact that the torpedoes they were using, even though the explosive part was good, but they couldn't get them aimed right. They couldn't get them tracking correctly. They couldn't get them aimed right. And they both also talked about their joint interest in inventing. Now, George and Hedy, again, were both very patriotic. She was absolutely by far the favorite pinup. Her face appeared on barracks, on foxholes, on ship bunks, on airplanes, on panels, multiple things like that. There was no evidence of romance between the two of them, George Antheil and Hedy. However, because Hedy was the most beautiful woman in the world, George's wife was still not happy. Nonetheless, the two of them were focused on making better torpedo guidance system. Early in the 1940s, everyone had trouble with torpedoes. Duds and post-release and jamming and things of that nature. Wire guidance helped. There was a wire guided, but you run out of wire pretty quick. And it helps, but they still needed work. They still weren't there. Now, what George had been familiar with, Hedy didn't know about. Anyone remember the Philco Corporation? Everybody's probably too young. Okay, somebody does. Thank you for remembering Philco. Philco, way back in 1939, before these two met, came out with something, a remote control device, one of the first ever, called Mystery Control. It was for radios. Remote tuning. You had a dial, and you dialed one of 8 stations. You could preset stations and dial them in. You also could dial the volume control. If you wanted to turn the radio on, you had to go to it and turn the switch on. And then you could dial that. But this was the first ever remote control. Radio control was futuristic at the time, but it was not a new idea, therefore it was not a patentable idea. Hedy's idea of hopping frequencies made radio control much less susceptible to jamming, because part of the problem with torpedoes and other munitions was jamming. Hedy's idea was radio control, but in a unique way to defeat jamming. She said, instead of using one signal and sending that signal, and somebody tunes in that frequency and jams it, send a chip of information on this signal, then hop to another one in the same frequency band, then hop to another, then another, then another, then another, multiple different frequencies within the band. Hop from one frequency seemingly randomly to others. Not seemingly, because if you know on this side and you know on this side what the frequency hopping is going to be, then you're fine. If you don't know in the middle, it seems random. Just send a chip of information, a small segment of a signal on any one frequency, hop to the next one. As long as the receiver knows the frequencies and the timing of change and the size of the chips, it's very difficult to jam. And even if some of it goes away, you still get most of the signal. Here's the scenario that she envisioned. There's a submarine or a surface ship that's firing the torpedo. There's a target ship that sees the wake of the torpedo and tries to jam the homing signals. Airplane on top sees the wake of the torpedo going away from the ship, radios the sub that fired it and said, hey, they're trying to avoid this thing. The sub then sends a signal to the torpedo using frequency hopping, spread spectrum, to correct it to go back where it goes, and hopefully, boom, the tanker's gone, the trip. That's her scenario. That's what she assumed was going to happen. It receives it, it goes, whatever. Hedy had the idea, and the idea is really good, but an idea is not enough for a patent. George remembered player pianos from his Ballet Mécanique. They're driven by rolls of punched paper tape. I remember punched paper tape on printers and stuff, but they're also on player pianos. Each row signifying a note, and they're synchronized, this side, that side. It's very analogous to the frequencies in a transmission band. Now, okay, that's fine, that can work, let's see. To get a patent, you can't just have an idea, you have to what they call reduce it to practice. And George Antheil's conducting and his composing and his experiences were invaluable here. Under the picture of Hedy, by the way, that's part of what they submitted for the patent, part of the napkin sketch that they used to show how spread spectrum would work, how the frequency hopping would work, etc. The punch paper tape control rolls of player pianos gave George an idea of how to make the separate machines talk to each other in synchrony. So they too together applied for a patent for an idea for radio-controlled torpedo, which gradually mutated into something called secret communication system. And in 1942, patent number 229-2387 was issued to George Antheil. And if you remember, I said, remember the name of that second husband, Markey? She didn't use Hedy Lamarr as the name. She used Hedy Keesler-Markey. Wanted to keep attention away. Wanted to not necessarily get publicity for this. Just keep it quiet. Well, the Navy looked at this and said, yeah, nah, we don't think that. The mechanism is too bulky to be incorporated into the average torpedo. Now, Hedy and George, who had thought about this, said, oh, God, they're thinking that we want to put a player piano on the torpedoes. That's not what they were trying to do. That was just the idea. But nonetheless, the Navy said, no, can't do it. No. But they kept the patent. They didn't throw the patent away. They had no inkling at the time, 1942, how they were going to use this, but they kept the patent. It wasn't until 1976, 34 years later, that they actually started using this and using spread spectrum and releasing it for other people to use. Neither George nor Hedy got 1 cent for their invention. The Navy still has not explained why they turned down the idea but kept the patent. George said, I'm going back to Hollywood. I'm going to start composing, writing music, and he did. Movie music, compositions, etc. He became one of the fairly well-known figures in modern music. Hedy, as I said, she was patriotic. Since she couldn't contribute to the Navy by giving them this invention, they wouldn't take it, she said, okay, I will do war bond drives. And she showed up doing war bond drives all through World War II. She brought in about $25 million in bonds. No other actress brought in anywhere near that much. One day, she brought in $7 million in bonds. One day. That's still a record for bonds anywhere. Spread spectrum. There are 2 types. And the objective of spread spectrum is to make a transmission appear to be just noise, background noise. Hedy's type is frequency hopping. The other type is called direct sequence. It was a little later development. Frequency hopping. George Ann Thiel's original idea for putting this into practice was to use 88 different frequencies. Why 88? Keys on a piano. He was a piano player. Actually, what's used is anywhere either 75 or 77 different frequencies in a somewhat random sequence. It can't be completely random because you have to know where it is on the other side. Shared by the transmitter and the receiver. And of those, usually there are 22 distinct hopping patterns. And you start sending with one pattern, hop here, hop here, hop here, and then you switch to another pattern, hop here, up there, then you switch to another pattern as you go in and as you send it. It's synchronized to the sender, frequent changes in what the pattern is so people don't guess what that pattern is. Direct sequence, every bit gets something added to it. Every bit is segmented and sent over different frequencies. The receiver blends the chips together, strips off the add-ons to decode the original signal. It looks and sounds like noise, like background noise. Multiple direct sequence signals can complicate eavesdropping. When you combine frequency hopping and direct sequence, it works very, very well. It's difficult to you can eavesdrop on it, but you don't get anything. You have to know exactly what's being done to be able to get it. Who uses this? Every cell phone on Earth uses this. It uses what used to be called the garbage bands, industrial, scientific, medical, ISM bands. Sharing of a common band among users. The users don't have to coordinate. The band is there. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, global positioning, MILSAT, fleet tracking, RFID tags, drones use this, barcode readers. And again, she never got a penny for this. And never really chased after getting money for it either. What she wanted was some recognition for it. In her latter days, she started to get not necessarily resentful. One of the things that is a characteristic of her, she really had a sense of humor. Even to her very last days, she was able to laugh at things and even laugh at herself. Finally, some engineers started looking at this. One engineer said, you know, we really ought to give this lady an award. Well, another engineer said, nah, she didn't do much. She just basically had a little idea. sexist viewpoint, actually. The other engineer found her, talked to her, found out that she did hold the patent. Mrs. Markey held the patent, and said, yeah, she really ought to get this award, and convinced the others that she should. In 1993, the Electronic Frontier Foundation gave her what's called a Pioneer Award. Who else has a Pioneer Award? Douglas Engelbart, the inventor of the mouse. Vinton Cerf, one of the people who you know definitely from internet, one of the inventors of the internet, if you will, and people of that realm and of that stature. She fits that stature, according to them. She's gotten some other inventing and engineering awards, but the problem is now it was 1990s, and someone who had been called the most beautiful woman in the world was no longer the most beautiful woman in the world. She had had some plastic surgery, and it really didn't go well. She wanted people to remember her as this Hedy Lamarr, or the Hedy Lamarr portrayed on the slides, not necessarily the Hedy Lamarr who was 80 years old and had some bad plastic surgery. She moved to Florida, outside Orlando, small town outside Orlando, and lived there pretty much as a recluse. Even though she still had a sense of humor, though, she still laughed at things. And she didn't go to these award things. She sent radio messages and other things to people giving the awards. What she really wanted to do was make it to the next century. And she did by 19 days. She died in 19 January 2000, and she was 85 years old. Lessons I think we can learn from this. There are a few of them. Number one, when she was sitting at Fritz Mandel's table, listening to all these military officers and munitions people talk about the great things they had done and what they were doing and their inventions, she soaked up that knowledge. Learn what you can, where you can. They didn't expect that she'd be learning, but she did. Lesson number two, beauty does not preclude brains. It doesn't guarantee them either, granted, but it doesn't preclude them. Just because someone is gorgeous doesn't mean she's not brilliant also. Three, you might have great ideas, but somebody else might need to help you to put it into practice. Don't be reluctant to ask for help in fleshing out your ideas. George Ann Thiel was the perfect partner for her for doing the things that she wanted to get done. And finally, credit isn't always monetary, and it may not come immediately. She waited a long time. First of all, for the Navy to recognize what it had, and then for the engineering community to recognize the contribution that she had made. Every one of us uses spread spectrum today, and will continue to do so, and it comes from the most beautiful woman in the world. If you're interested in this some more, there's a couple of books to recommend. Strongly recommend this one. Richard Rhodes, he's written 3 books on the atom bomb. Anyone read those? Dark Sun. This is his book on Hedy. It's called Hedy's Folly. And the folly was thinking that the Navy would understand what she was trying to do and what she actually gave them. I'd strongly recommend that one. There's a few other books on divas, and yes, she was a diva. And you can find almost anything on Wi-Fi security. And even for the kids, Women Inventors Who Changed the World. You can, there's several other books there too. I'm open for questions, and actually we even have a few minutes before lunch, so we can get there early before everybody else does. Questions, comments, war stories, rebuttals. Thanks for staying through. Thank you.